You may well think that the village of Mortlake, with its modest population, would have been pretty much a crime-free place. And in many ways you would be right. But there have been some fascinating and varied crimes committed here over the centuries. We have had and punishments have been as varied too. The Metropolitan Police first took over the role of crime prevention and the apprehension of offenders in Mortlake in 1839. Before that, this responsibility lay with the local community. In Mortlake, this meant the parish vestry. This watercolour of St Mary's shows the vestry house, which was built in 1670 on its north side. Mortlake Vestry's records begin in 1578. The parish vestry was made up of local rate-paying men and was very powerful. It controlled local finances. It was responsible for the order and conduct of parishioners, and it appointed parish officers such as the beadle and constable. The constable could lock up disorderly persons in the watch-house or put them in the village stocks. In the 17th century, fines were often imposed for minor offences and were collected by the vestry. In 1654, Andrew Driver was fined £1 for serving beer without a licence. John Andrews was elected beadle in April 1787 at a salary of £5 plus a greatcoat and hat, and he was ordered to keep the parish clear of beggars. He was also ordered to visit alehouses on Sundays and to fine both the landlord and any persons found drinking on the premises. William Walland, another beadle, was paid 2 shillings a week in 1808 to stop men and boys from gambling, particularly on Sundays. Some local punishments could be harsh. Mortlake had a ducking stool for scolds. It cost £3 and 7 shillings in 1662. A frame and whip were kept in the church for punishing drunkards. Because of the increase in begging in the 1820s, the vestry ordered that 3 sturdy men from the workhouse, provided with greatcoats and staves, were to be stationed at the main roads into the parish to warn away suspicious persons. And then the Metropolitan Police took charge in Mortlake in 1839. But let's go back to pre-Metropolitan Police times. An Act of 1406 stated that stocks must be provided in every town and village in England, and that no village was considered complete or even worthy the name of village without its stocks, so essential were they to due order and government. A few hours in the village stocks was a common punishment for minor offences, such as cheating. For example, if you were a shopkeeper and sold short measures or put chalk in the flour, you went into the stocks. It was a punishment that involved public humiliation. This 1910 photograph shows Mortlake's wooden stocks and its fire engine. The stocks were placed by the watch house, and offenders would have their feet locked in and their shoes removed. Villagers would shout abuse, and rubbish of all sorts would be aimed at the miscreants, who would remain in the stocks in all weathers. In September 1705, Mortlake had to have a new set of stocks, as the existing ones were described as useless. And in 1807 they were replaced once more. I think they were well used. The practice of putting offenders in the stocks was abolished in 1872. As we have already seen, from early medieval times, individual towns and villages were responsible for their own law and order, and, along with the stocks, the local night watch was introduced. The watchman in Mortlake carried a lantern, a stout stick, a blunderbuss, and a rattle, and later they had pistols and a sword. They were on duty from 10 p.m. until 6 a.m., and they called the hour, always prefixing this with the word past. For example, it's past 2 o'clock. They also called out the state of the weather in the mornings. Each watchman had a watch box. There were 5 or 6 in Mortlake, scattered around the village. One was near Kew Meadows Path, and another at Milestone Green. However, by the early 19th century, the watch was pretty ineffectual, and had become a laughingstock both nationally and locally. There were distressing cases of body snatching from St Mary's churchyard, and a general increase in local robberies, but the watchmen were just too old to catch the culprits. A pamphlet published in London in 1827 expressed the views of many. Several thousand watchmen are required by the Watchmen's Company, but it is no use applying unless the applicant is very old, nearly blind, asthmatic, deaf as a post, whose speed would not equal that of a snail, and whose arm would not arrest an old washerwoman returning from a hard day's fag at the wash-tub. He must carry a lantern with which to light his pipe, and to hang up in his box whenever he takes his nap. Apart from the watch boxes, the watchman and the constable needed a watch house in which to detain drunk or disorderly individuals. And so, as early as 1695, the Mortlake Vestry decided to build a watch house next to the parish church. This drawing shows St Mary's with the watch house in the front on the left in 1750. The incompetence of local watchmen led in part to the setting up of the Metropolitan Police Service, and in 1839 the watch house was cleaned before the police moved in, and it was then called the police station. The Mortlake police force consisted of 2 sergeants, who lived in Sheen Lane, and 7 constables. 3 of the local constables slept on the upper floor of the police station. However, they continually complained of the awful stench which rose through the cracks in the floor from the dead bodies which were stored in the room below. This was the sexton's tool house, which doubled up as the place where dead bodies were kept prior to identification. This became unbearable in August 1847, when 3 drowned men were left there for days, as the coroner could not attend immediately. The policeman moved into the Queen's Head and refused to sleep in the watch house again. The police station in front of St Mary's remained standing long after it was abandoned by the local police. From 1896 it was occupied by a boot and shoe business owned by Mr. Alfred Grayson. This was now 102 Mortlake High Street. This photograph of Mr. Grayson shows the carvings on the door in his shop in 1937. The shop was small and cramped and was originally the charge room. At the back of the shop there were 2 brick-lined chambers, which were the cells. The door was covered with iron plate, and the old bolts and padlocks were still attached. The door was in 2 halves, like a horse box, to allow food to be passed in, but without letting the prisoner escape. Mr. Grayson's business survived the Second World War, but all the buildings which stood in front of St. Mary's, including his shop and Eastwood's, were demolished in the 1960s. There were very few prisons in England before the mid-19th century, and these were mainly used to hold people who were in debt or awaiting trial. So transportation of offenders was a common punishment. As early as 1615, convicted felons could be offered a pardon from a death sentence on condition they agreed to be transported for 14 years. Convicts were originally sent to North America or the West Indies, but with the loss of the American colonies, convicts were transported to Australia. In London, convicted prisoners were usually sent to a prison hulk before being transported. These hulks were unseaworthy salvaged warships anchored on the Thames off Woolwich. Conditions on these rotting vessels were awful, with seasickness and dreadful overcrowding. Once a transportation vessel was available, convicts were transferred from the hulks to sea-going ships. They were manacled and treated very much like the slaves who were transported from West Africa to the Caribbean. Charles Dickens' character Magwitch, in Great Expectations, had escaped from a prison hulk when he first meets Pip. This was in about 1812. Magwitch is later recaptured and transported to New South Wales. There are 4 recorded cases of transportation from Mortlake. One of these was Francis Bodnam. He was convicted in January 1815 of bigamy. He had married Amy Patey in 1812, and they lived in Mortlake with Amy's mother. Francis and Amy had 2 children. He then left Amy and married Eliza Keach, who gave evidence at his trial. Eliza stated, "The prisoner came courting to me. He said he was a single man. He had been married, but that his wife died in childbirth. I was married to the prisoner on the 4th of June, 1813. Bodnam was found guilty and sentenced to be transported for 7 years. He was held in Newgate Prison and later put aboard the ship the Sir William Bensley. He was among 200 other male convicts who arrived in Sydney in March 1817. Mary Strikes was convicted in January 1824 of theft from her employer. She had lived in Mortlake and hidden stolen goods in a box with Mrs. Hawkes in Mortlake. which the local constable found. Strikes had stolen dishes, plates, wine glasses, a silver wine label, books and a mug from her employer. She had also stolen similar goods from 5 others to the value of 39 shillings, and she was sentenced to 14 years transportation. Mary sailed to Australia on the ship Granada in September 1826. There were 88 female convicts aboard, and the ship arrived in Sydney in January 1827. 4 women died during the journey. George Hill was a lighterman and was convicted in July 1837 of theft. Joseph Thorpe was a witness at his trial. I keep a cheesemonger's shop at East Sheen in the parish of Mortlake. At 10:15 o'clock my shop door was opened and the prisoner came in. I heard a bustle and saw the cheese fall. I pursued him to the door and he ran off. The patrol came up. I told him and he pursued him and brought him back with this cheese in his possession. He is the same person I saw go out of the shop. This is my cheese. It is worth about 9 shillings. Hill was found guilty and sentenced to transportation for 7 years. He said at his trial that he stole the cheese through distress. Thomas Woodcock was the 4th transportee from Mortlake. He was a shoemaker who had again stolen clothing and money, and he too was transported to Australia for 7 years. That was in 1835. Once in Australia, male convicts performed heavy manual work, while female convicts often became domestic servants. Transportation was abolished in 1868, and some 162,000 people were transported to Australia in the 81 years in which it was practiced. 7 out of 8 of these transportees were male, some as young as 9 and others over 80 years old. There are several recorded cases in Mortlake of people attempting to pass on counterfeit coins, usually in local public houses. Both the manufacture and distribution of fake coins were described as royal offences, and as such were dealt with severely by the courts. One such case involved Alfred Dawson, who was accused of coining in October 1847. William Davis was a witness at his trial. I keep the Queen's head at Mortlake. On the 22nd of September I served the prisoner some brandy. He tendered me a half-crown in payment. I bit it and found it was bad. It was put into the fire by the prisoner and he went away. George Day was a second witness. I keep the George public house at Mortlake. This picture shows both the George in the foreground and the Queen's head further down the High Street on the left. George Day continues with his evidence. On Wednesday, the 22nd of September, I saw the prisoner served with some brandy by Elizabeth Day, my niece. He put down a half-crown to pay for it, and I thought it was good. I bit it and found it was bad. He wanted me to give it him back. I said I would take care of that and him too. I sent for Mr. Davis of the Queen's Head, and he said the prisoner was the same person who had offered him a bad half-crown earlier. Dawson was found guilty, but was said to have been of good character, and he was sentenced to 6 months in prison. Incidents of murder in Mortlake were rare, and most are crimes of passion or desperation committed by family members. William Brown was accused of the willful murder of his wife Elizabeth in November 1902. William and Elizabeth had been married some 20 years and lived in Mullins Path. Her father lived in Hampton Square. William Cox was a witness. "I am 7 years old and live with my parents at 1 Mullins Path, Mortlake. On Saturday night I was near Senior Place, Mullins Path. I knew that Mr. and Mrs. Brown lived there. I heard 2 screams of murder in a woman's voice, which I knew was Mrs. Brown's. I opened the garden gate, looked through the kitchen window, and saw the prisoner kicking Mrs. Brown, who was lying on the floor against the table. I saw him kick her on her forehead." There were several more witnesses, including 2 other young boys, in this lengthy trial. The jury found William Brown guilty and sentenced him to death. The trial of Mr. and Mrs. Seddon is particularly poignant. Marion Seddon was tried for the murder of her husband John in October 1905. They ran a small shop at 72 Mortlake High Street. And this 1896 drawing by Albert Betts is of 72 High Street. John Seddon was 78 years old and in poor health, and Marion had been made ill with worry. Marion and John both took a dose of poison because they could not pay their rent and feared they would have to go to the workhouse and be separated. Marion survived the poison, but John died. Dr. Robert McIntosh was a witness at the trial. "I am a medical practitioner at the bungalow, Mortlake. I was called in to see the prisoner and her husband on September the 12th, about 8:45 a.m. I found them in bed together, and I diagnosed that they were suffering from belladonna poisoning. I attended to them for about 2 hours, administering antidotes and every remedy that I possessed. At the end of the 2 hours, the prisoner, Marion, had improved, but the deceased was weaker. I advised that they should be sent to the hospital, and I communicated with the police. I saw a bottle on the table, empty. It was quite dry inside. It smelt of belladonna liniment. I judged that the husband had taken the larger dose." The verdict of the jury was that John had died from the effects of swallowing belladonna and aconite, and that he took his own life while in a state of temporary insanity owing to financial troubles. The jury found Marion guilty of murder, but stated that "we wish her to be strongly recommended to mercy. We are unanimous on that point." Infant murder was not uncommon in the 19th century, and there had been 3 or 4 babies found dead locally just before the case I am about to describe. Many babies died because their mothers were totally impoverished. Some young mothers were so desperate they would farm out their babies for a fee to unscrupulous women who would often allow the babies to die through neglect. Charlotte Cutler was accused of murdering her child, Frederick. The baby boy was born in the Kingston Workhouse Infirmary on the 4th of June, 1879. This is a photograph of Kingston Infirmary in 1917. Lucy Whitbread was a witness at Charlotte's trial. I am head nurse at the infirmary at Kingston Union. During the time she, Charlotte, was in the workhouse, she treated the baby kindly. It was a very nice child. She nursed and suckled it and dressed it and behaved to it as a good mother. Charlotte left the infirmary to live with her parents at West End, Mortlake. On the 18th of July, the body of a male child was found in a ditch on the lower Mortlake road. And Charlotte said at her trial that, "I only wish to say that I did not murder my child, and I was in hopes he was alive. I gave him to a person on the bridge near the gas factory, and I asked her if she would take him to the Richmond Union for me, and I gave her a shilling. That was all the money I was possessed of, and she promised me faithfully she would take him the next morning." Charlotte's baby was not taken to the Richmond workhouse and was never discovered. The baby in the ditch could not be identified, so Charlotte was found not guilty of his murder. Amy Gregory, however, was found guilty of the murder of her child, Frances Maud, in March 1895. This is a drawing of Richmond Union Workhouse in 1902. Both the Kingston and Richmond workhouses were very substantial institutions. Isabel Preston was a witness at Amy's trial. "I am a nurse at the Richmond Union Workhouse. I was at the workhouse when the prisoner was admitted on the 12th of December. She said that she was single. She came into the workhouse for the purpose of her confinement. I was there when the birth of the child was registered. The prisoner and child remained in the workhouse until the 24th of January. During the time they were there, the child was in a very healthy condition. The prisoner left of her own accord." After Amy left the workhouse with her child, she called on several women in Mortlake in an attempt to find someone to take and look after her baby, but without success. Dr. Matthew Gardner was a witness. "I am a medical practitioner at Richmond. On Thursday, 21st of February, I was called to the police station. I there saw the body of a female child, which I judged to be about a month old. It was very emaciated. There was no food in the stomach or intestines, and hardly any fat on the body. It weighed 5½ pounds. Amy Gregory was accused of killing her child and said in her defence, "I did not murder my child. It died of starvation. I lost my milk through worry. I had no money to get food and no work." Amy was found guilty and sentenced to death, but she was strongly recommended to mercy by the jury, in consequence of her state of mind at the time, owing to her extreme destitution. There is no record to say what punishment Amy eventually received. Theft has always been the highest category of offences in England. Even in the Middle Ages, 3/4 of all crimes were of theft. Today it is 2/3. In 1838, Thomas Cuff was found guilty of stealing 3 pounds of soap, and George Wigley stole a pair of spectacles. In the following year, Mary Read was found guilty of stealing coals and potatoes from her employer. George Exel, a drayman at the Phillips and Wigan, later Watney's brewery, was found guilty of stealing a cask of ale in February 1869. John Eindman was found guilty of stealing a sheep from a paddock in Ship Lane in September 1893. He was sentenced to 3 months' imprisonment with hard labour. Philip Knott, aged 52, was sent to prison for 3 months for stealing a bushel of onions from William Atwood of Mortlake in October 1843. Children also appeared before the courts, and their punishment could be harsh. This is Wandsworth Prison. John Greening was accused in 1871 and again in 1873 of theft. He was about 9 years old and lived with his parents at one senior place off Mortlake High Street. John's crimes appear to have been committed for the benefit of his family rather than for personal gain. Wandsworth Prison's record shows that in 1873 John Greening was 4 feet 4 1/4 inches tall. He had brown hair and a fresh complexion. He also had a scar on his forehead. In March 1871, John had been sentenced to 10 days' imprisonment for stealing coal. In February 1873, he was again found guilty of stealing coal and was sentenced to a whipping and imprisonment in Wandsworth Jail for 2 months. Later in 1873, John, now aged about 11, was found guilty of stealing 1 quart of gooseberries. He was sent to Wandsworth Prison for 1 month with hard labour, and from there he was to serve 5 years at a reformatory in East Ham. In 1895, a petty sessional court was built in Mortlake to deal with minor crimes. It was near to the railway on Sheen Lane and is now a part of Thompson House School. This is a drawing by Lewis Turner of the police court. The petty crimes brought before the Mortlake court in the 1890s were wide-ranging. The truant inspector was always busy, and many parents were fined 5 shillings for not sending their children to school. Summonses were common for those being drunk on a public highway, which resulted in fines of 10 to 20 shillings. Examples of crimes on the river were not uncommon. Mr. Buss, captain of the steam tug Eclipse, was fined £10 for being on the river in possession, River Thames, without taking due care and attention. Offenders could also be fined for being in possession of unsound meat or having an unmuzzled dog. Vagrants could expect to receive 14 days hard labour in Wandsworth Prison. 2 boys aged 14 and 11 were found guilty of throwing brickbats at a train at North Sheen Station. The older boy was sentenced to 14 days in Wandsworth Prison, and the younger had 6 strokes of the birch. Many boys were found guilty of throwing stones at pleasure steamers on the Thames. The RSPCA often brought cases of cruelty to animals, and on one occasion a man was given a 5-shilling fine for cruelly beating and ill-treating a bay gelding pony. Another case involved a man who was accused of furiously driving a horse. Prostitutes were generally fined 6 shillings, and being drunk and disorderly usually meant a 10-shilling fine. In March 1893, a total of 137 cases were heard in Mortlake. This was a typical month. Over the next 50 years, the number of cases brought before the court became fewer, but offences in the 1940s displayed a similarity with those from the 1890s. There were many examples of drivers exceeding the speed limit, and this usually meant a 30-shilling fine. Drunkenness was commonplace and taken seriously by the court. A man received a £20 fine plus 5 guineas costs for exceeding the speed limit and driving while drunk. Receiving 4 tins of corned beef worth £12 15 shillings and 9pence, knowing them to be stolen and the property of the US military forces, meant a fine of £20. The same punishment was handed down to the person who received 19 tins of sausage meat. Local people were clearly short of food during the war, and there were also examples of stealing from allotments and receiving stolen ration documents. Hearings for maintenance arrears, where husbands neglected to maintain their wives and children, were frequent. Theft had been a constant throughout the centuries, but the stealing of 62 packs of playing cards from the Star and Garter home in Richmond is one of the more bizarre. During the 1950s, the Mortlake bench continued to hear cases of shoplifting, theft, and various motor offences. A case of indecent exposure on a train from Richmond to Mortlake resulted in a fine of £10. Spitting on a bus meant a 10-shilling fine. One man stole coal and coke from a watchman's fire. A number of youths were summoned for snowballing, and a boy was fined 2 shillings and 6pence for riding a bicycle without a light on Clifford Avenue. In 1960, the mayor remarked on the significant increase in offences involving drunkenness. Both the A6 murder and the Great Train robbery had connections with Mortlake. The A6 murder took place in August 1961 and was a particularly nasty crime. It involved the shooting dead of a scientist and the attempted murder of his girlfriend in a lay-by on the A6 in Bedfordshire. Peter Alphon was the police's first suspect. Alphon was also charged with grievous bodily harm at Mortlake Magistrates' Court the following month, in September 1961. Alphon was accused of brutally attacking Mrs. Dalal, who lived on the Upper Richmond Road. He was remanded in custody in Mortlake on the 23rd of September. He was found not guilty, but the case attracted large crowds outside the Mortlake courthouse. James Hanratty was later found guilty of the A6 murder and hanged in 1962. However, in 1967, Alphon claimed he was the killer, but the true identity of the A6 murderer will never probably be known. William, or Bill Bowl, was a precision engineer who had a workshop in Queen's Road, Mortlake. He went before the Mortlake magistrates in April 1963. He had been arrested after a scuffle with the police while cycling around the Upper Richmond Road area in the early hours of the morning. Bowl was bound over to keep the peace and fined 4 shillings. Later that same year, in August 1963, Bowl was accused of being an accomplice in the Great Train robbery. He was sentenced to 24 years in prison for his alleged part in the robbery, but according to Bowl himself and the other convicted train robbers, Bole was innocent. He died in prison in 1970. Throughout the 1960s, less renowned local crimes continued to be heard at Mortlake Court. Theft of groceries from local shops, snowballing, housebreaking, neighbour disputes, assault, and an alarming increase in motoring offences. New crimes also emerged, defrauding the DHSS and the possession of cannabis and LSD. One unfortunate homeless man stole 2 bottles of gin one cold November evening in 1970, hoping to secure a night in a warm police cell. However, he received a 12-month prison sentence instead. This is a photograph of Mortlake Court, built in 1895 and looking very derelict in the 1980s. The court had closed in 1975, and all local cases were then heard in Richmond. But in 2016, Richmond Magistrates Court also closed, and cases are now heard in Wimbledon or Lavender Hill, not very local to Mortlake. Furthermore, since 2017, when the Sovereign Gate police station in Richmond closed, our nearest police station is now in Twickenham. We began our story in early medieval England, where local communities were mainly responsible for the administration of their own order and punishment. Mortlake Parish Vestry then passed this responsibility to the Metropolitan Police in 1839, where the local police force both lived and worked in Mortlake. The Petty Sessional Court, with local magistrates, administered local justice and was situated in the centre of the village near to the railway station. But now all connections between the crimes committed locally and their punishment are lost.